this one does. Okay. This line may look straight, but it is not. Now let's start our rule surf. Or to do rule surf, we need to make sure our surf tabs are appropriately set. Let's just type in rule surf and see what we get as a solution. Okay. While that's okay, notice that we have a hole at the end of the mesh. We would need to drag that mesh to the end, but also notice the lack of detail. So the problem here is not so much just closing the mesh. The problem is the surf tab 1, which we will change to 36 in order to give it more shape detail. Now, we have a model layer and we have an image layer as well as a zero layer. For the sake of argument, we rule surf every other element. 1, 2, and I'll turn off line weight. Rule surf 1, 2, rule surf 1, 2, and rule surf these two. Now, that gives us elements that we can now see. But as you guys have noticed in the class, we cannot select the lines underneath. The solution is to move these objects by selecting them and moving them to the model layer. They turn green. Now all we have to do is turn or freeze the model layer, and we can now see all the lines again. We type in rule surf and do the other alternating elements. Rule surf this element to this element, this element to this element, this element to that element. If we would have changed our layer to model, it would have been nice, but because we're using model to move information, you don't want to have it all seen and causing you not to be able to use the lines again. So this is why this technique is proposed, so that data can be moved to layers accordingly. Now I've moved this information to a layer that's frozen. It's okay, it disappears, but if I unfreeze that layer, here's our mesh. Okay? And let's type orbit and move around the object, and there we go. Now in some cases we have an issue. I have a contour line that's lower. That's not problematic. The question would be, it's lower because I gave it that elevation. Let's assume that that's wrong. These meshes then become no good. And let's check our elevation. So let's turn off the model, freeze the model again, and let's click on that object. It has an elevation of 120. This has an elevation of 140. So this line should be at an elevation of 160 if we want it to be a continuously sloped element. We now do rule surf, and we solve from here to here. We take this element, put it on model, let it go away, and we'll rule surf the other two elements. We put it on model by selecting it and putting it on the model layer, and then when we unfreeze model, we see a continuously sloped element. In some cases you will have things that require ditches or rivers, and this is really how we would show a river, is contours that are lower than others, which creates a suppressed element, and thus you have a river. Orbit, just to analyze the mesh, and we now see that mesh is complete. If I type hide, you now see it in hidden mode. Regen, and it comes back. Now, we do not need the image anymore. We haven't needed it for quite some time, and we now want to close the sides of the mesh along here. I'm thus going to freeze the mesh layer again, okay, and we have to draw a UCS that defines the side of the object. This is so that we can close the sides. P-line from here to here to here, and simply close the element. I can type rule surf now, or I can do it later, but let's do it now. and I want to rule surface from this element to that element. Didn't work because we need a line along this bottom edge. That's a single line. Rule surf from this element to this element, and there it is. Now, we still have issues where elements are going to have be open. See there? So what I recommend, and what you should consider strongly, is to change the surf tab to the number of faces that exist. And that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for this side. Rule surf again. This element to that element. And now we can match our faces. This one goes way up here, and this one goes to that end. And now we know that we have perfect closure along that side. As well, it's hidden. Okay? The mesh is off. We can take this and move it to the mesh layer if you choose to now, or we can wait. Okay? Let's do the next side. Regen, UCS, origin, pointing the X, pointing the Y, P line, trace the side. Now you see why it was very important, P line at the bottom, to create lines that hit the corners. We do rule surf, but first count the number of faces. 1, 2, 3. So let's do surf tab. 1 to 3. Rule surf. This defining curve to that defining curve. Match your faces. And you now know that's a closed object. Orbit. Orbit around this object. Pan with your dynamic pan button, which is the roller, by pressing it down. And let's do UCS. UCS origin, pointing the X, pointing the Y. P line. 1, 2. You just trace that edge. We put a line at the bottom. Rule surf, but first count your faces. 1, 2, 3, 4. So surf tab 1 should be 4. Rule surf, top to bottom. Match your faces so that you close any holes that exist in the mesh. And I did that so I can find that endpoint. Orbit around. And we do the last face. Count the number of faces. 1, 2. Surf tab. 1 should be what? 2. We draw or create a UCS origin, pointing the X, pointing the Y. P line. 1, 2, 3 points. Create 2 faces. We do rule surf. Well, P line at the bottom, or line at the bottom as well, so that we have 2 objects. Rule surf from the top to the bottom. And we align our faces, and just so you can see what we're doing, we're closing that mesh. Okay. Now, we select these 4 elements, and we move them to the model layer. Now, we're not done. As in